There we go. Hey, okay. About the name. So you probably saw it as Deming the DevOps. Last year, DevOps asked me to do this presentation, and I went, I was getting tired of the Deming to DevOps name, and so I went into ChatGPT and said, here's my presentation, tell me what I should name it. And it came up what I thought was a terrible name. And then, but you know what, I couldn't come up with a better one, so I stuck with it. Now I like the name. I think it works, so, well, so y'all be the judge. So, so the agenda, real quick. This could be an hour presentation, so I gotta be really careful here. Let's see, we're gonna go through, I am gonna talk about Deming. And, I'll say this, I thought that was an amazing presentation. And there's some things I wanna talk about. But I think a lot of the stuff that we see, I could say, remember like everything we learned in kindergarten? I would say everything we needed to know about everything what happened last century, right? Like the engineering, the thing that came out of industrial, and we'll talk about, and Deming's a big part of that, not the only part. Oh, and generating pictures, so I gotta tell this story. This is why I always run out of time. So I'm like, I wanted to make a picture myself. So I started feeding it a bunch of stuff about it, and it just made terrible pictures. Finally, I got reasonably close. And so back to your sort of generating picture. And then it was a really good-looking man. I'm like, okay, can you make it less good-looking? And it did, but then it was skinny. I said, well, can you make it fatter? And this is what I got. I couldn't get rid of the beard, though. No matter what I did, I couldn't get rid of the beard. So I've done a lot of stuff. I think I go by the scorecard. I won more than I lost, but I lost some big ones. A lot of startups. I've probably done, I sort of lost count, depending on what you're counting, about 10 or 12 startups. Sold a company to Dell, sold a company to Docker. Today, I'm a fractional evangelist, so I fired all my clients except one, and it's MongoDB, and I focus on their vector database stuff, so really deeply into AI. Was one of the founders of DevOps Days, blah, 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 blah. I have written a lot of books, too. So I've gotten lucky in the people I met. Justin talked about the DevOps Handbook. I was real fortunate to do that. Patrick and Gene and Jez Humble. My sort of pride and joy is the book on the right. This is the book I'm going to sort of intertwine on why I think everything that was taught to us last century is important. And then I did this other this will come up, Investors Unlimited will come up a little bit. We do these studies. Gene Kim wrote the Phoenix Project, one of the most influential people in DevOps. He invites he runs a big conference, and then he invites us all to Portland to do these think tank things, right? And Nicole's been a big part of that. Gene's, and so like in 2019, we started thinking about automated governance, how the whole tragedy of how large companies do internal audit. And we turned it into paper, it became a book. 9 people, don't recommend writing a book with 9 people. And I am working on a book that is literally gonna be done with the first draft. I call it, the consultant I work with, we call it a Franken-draft. It means it is a readable draft, but it's about the history of the people who created AI. I call Rebels of Reason, and don't really have a cover yet, so I stole the cover from my old book. But it's a fascinating story. My Deming book is very much like I'm not as good a writer as Michael Lewis. Whether you think he's a good writer or not, that's another story. But like, it is that style of storytelling. I usually have 2 target readers. I have a subject matter expert in the topic, and my mother-in-law who reads romance novels. And it's not a bad thing. And my litmus test is that they both understand the book and enjoy the book. And hopefully I'm going to pull that off in the history of neural networks, right? So I like the idea of engineering excellence, right? Because one of the things Justin was telling me about your keynote and all, and I thought, like, how do I see the world? My whole career, 40, you round down when you get to my age, right? So let's say 40 years. It has been infrastructure and operations. I think that, like, in the end of the day, what we do in infrastructure operations is called DevOps, SRE, whatever you want to call it. We protect the brand, right? That's what we do, right? And so I, unfortunately or fortunately, see everything as that is the sort of focal point. Like, is this going to affect the brand? I work with really large corporations, right? Where, banks in particular, there's a financial institution I was currently working, 10 trillion in assets under management, right? That's a hard job to protect that brand, right? So I think it goes back to, like, there's the kid, I see technical debt. I see it everywhere. It's a curse. But Ward Cunningham, everybody's trying to rewrite his thing. You can, I know some of the large providers and stuff talk about rewriting it, all this stuff. He says it as simple as you can get, taking shortcuts. And again, I would say that taking shortcuts, not just software development, in the Kubernetes that you install, the Kafka, the everything, the writing the bash scripts that glue everything together, right? So, so technical debt is sort of a, something that I think a lot about, and I tie it. You talked about system thinking. Developers, and I'm being sort of just highly abstract right now, but developers sort of think about delivery pace and all that, and sort of the ops of the dev, sort of think about protecting scale, but how do I make you flow faster, right? So the system thinking part of it was the whole reason we created the sort of DevOps, right? It was system thinking. It was there's a bigger picture than just code. There's a bigger picture than just deploying software. And we're getting better, developer productivity, space, DevOps, all that stuff is intertwining a lot when you get into the metrics, right? But I think about what have we learned, and the answer is we probably haven't learned a lot. Because I've been doing this for quite a long time. I started as a systems programmer. It was actually called system programmer before it was called system administrator, and then it was called DevOps, and it's called SRE. Now it's called platform engineering, and it's going to be called an agentic engineer very soon. But we're just constantly building this sort of vicious technical debt. We have these things. We solve big world problems, and back then we solved massive amounts of consoles. In the 90s, we had systems automation, the first sort of array of large companies going to distributed computing. A lot of challenges in having 4 computers to now having 2,000 computers, right? 4 mainframes, 1,000 Sun, E50s or E100s, whatever they were back then. And then, in 2000, I was heavily involved in infrastructure as code. I was the sort of 7th or 8th person in at Chef. And that was fabulous. But there's technical debt all over all of these things. In fact, today I wonder, if you go into shop and there's almost 1 million lines of infrastructure as code. First of all, I don't think it should have ever been code, But that's the way we went, right? I mean, we already have a lot of code. Capital One had 20,000 Java developers at one point. That's a lot of Java code. Do we really want to add 30% more of bash scripts and terraforms and Pulumis and, right? I don't know. And then we had that sort of, for me personally, disastrous decade of the upside down whale. Over drinks tonight, maybe I'll tell you the real story of how I was in at Docker. I sold a company to Docker. But composable infrastructure, right? That's where we are, platforms like Kubernetes, right? And containers. And now we're into another, and so all these, read between the lines, right? It's you bought your first house in the 80s, you got your second mortgage in the 90s, you went ahead and you got stuck in the sort of adjustable arms, with the rates crashed on. You have the 2008 crash. I'm really concerned now about the technical debt. See, I don't really. It doesn't freak me out whether we're going to have AGI or ASI. I really don't care. Yeah, could this magical Terminator show up sometime and all this crap happen? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not too smart. I'm not smart enough to debate that. But what I am smart enough to know is this is happening, and the brand protectors have to roll up their sleeves. And that's really what this presentation is mostly about. And so, everybody heard the Abraham Wald story, right? Nodding heads, yeah. So I think this is a technical debt story or a system thinking story. So here's the story quickly, right? During World War II, there were a bunch of mathematicians and statisticians who would basically try to figure out what was the right weight distribution statistics to repair fighter planes to send them back. And Abraham Wald had this aha moment where he said, wait a minute, we got it all wrong. We're repairing where the bullet holes aren't. We need to repair where the bullet holes are not, because they're the ones that aren't coming back. And so a sub-theme of this presentation is we need to think about where the bullet holes aren't. I think, in the people where, I think they got two things wrong, right? Like, I get things wrong, everybody gets things wrong. That one quote about, like, you can't measure what you can't manage, right? Actually, you probably could go back. There's a book about misquotes of people who had misquotes. But the Dr. Deming supposedly said that. But you know what he really said? The next sentence was, the sentence is, you can't manage what you can't measure. But then Deming said, but you have to manage it anyway. Like, that's a cop-out, right? Like, there are things we cannot, a lot of stuff in your presentation is space, right? So this is more of system thinking of, like, how do we think about things? The other thing, like, only measure defects. So John Osbar, who's, adaptive capacity, he would say that incidents are unplanned investments. In other words, and they also talk about, like, we should figure out the things that work. Because, by the way, they might not be working. Like, they might work 1,000,000 times in a row, and the 1,000,000th one is when you have the disaster. So there's a lot to learn about thinking about the stuff that goes right, or thinking about the stuff, forcing yourself, the scientific mindset. Talk about that in a little bit. And so I hate OKRs, by the way. So sorry if I ruin your day, or you want to fight me later, or play beer pong, I don't know, whatever. But I had some fun with, Deming hated, and I know I haven't, like, I'm teasing the crap out of you because I haven't told you who Deming is yet, but he basically hated MBOs, and so he cared more about, like, how did you do it? And so I had some poking fun, again, ChatGPT, hey, create me an OKR, and he actually tried to do it right, and I'm like, darn you, that's not what I wanted. I want you to assume before Abraham Wald came up with his aha moment. And but this is the thing. Look at this, like, repair 100% of the planes, 100% first off, bullshit, right? There's no such thing as 100%. Increase visibility, damage by reduction of 20%, 80% allocation. Like, it is how we do things, right? There's nothing about the resilience, which is another sub-theme. The bullet hole story is really a resilience theme. It's looking at the thing, I think the better metric is, like, we're not actually saying what we really care about is how many pilots come back alive, right? That brings us into the resilience problem of how do we solve that. I loved your part about the sort of the why. And I'll talk about that in a little bit about operational definitions and why they're important. I don't say I think I might have first use on shadow AI. As I saw people, I started building notebooks, doing a lot of coding. And then I started seeing all these bad habits occur, people leaving their sort of credentials and passwords in the files. As well, John, it's only test. And that's how this thing cascades, right? So I wrote that. And then we got together, because a bunch of us started worrying about this at scale, like guys from Fidelity, people from Starbucks, a different bunch of people. And we wrote, how many people read the Phoenix Project? Quite a few, right? So we wrote a story. The Investments on Limited Automated Governance was sort of a Phoenix Project style, right? It is the hero's journey. So we wrote a hero's journey, and the hero's journey was what I'm seeing right now is that CEOs are hiring chief AI officers. And they're actually telling their chief AI officers, stay away from the CIO. You've got to go fast. This is do or die. I mean, these are real words. I asked the chief AI officer once at a large company, I won't even say what type of company, because there's only 3 of them, and I asked her if all the infrastructure they built, which was phenomenal, platform-based AI, I mean, doing Kafka, I mean, all the things you're going to get to when you migrate from notebooks to real stuff, all right? But the thing was, I said, by the way, because I just had a conversation about LaneGraph and like how they took Open API and just sucked it in and like brilliantly understood all their APIs and everything from like Swagger and all that. And that was cool. But then I said, what happens if LaneGraph gets compromised? And then I asked in follow up on the chief AI, I was like, have you discussed any of this with the CISO? And you could hear a pin drop in the state that their headquarters was in, because the answer was no, but it was like a lot of squirmy face stuff, So we wrote a story about this. It's really fun. It's a quick read. It's free. You just got to register at IT Revolution. But our difference is there is a hero, and it's a CIO. And by the way, the CIO, I believe, has to become the hero now, because if the CEO is saying to the chief AI officer, stay away from that person, in our story, our CIO ignored that and literally planted himself with the chief AI officer and said, hey, like, I've seen this movie before, Shadow IT, cloud, right? So why does Deming matter? I wrote a whole book about it. And one of the interesting things is Deming died in 1993, so he missed all the fun, right? And so in the last third of my book, I tried to say, what would he do with like DevOps and Agile? What would he think about the Agile Manifesto? And more importantly, I sort of ended it on cyber and how he would sort of think about cyber. So, and so let me step out of the Deming thing for a minute. Is Mark Andreessen in system thinking, right? Mark Andreessen said in 2011, pretty like cool that he saw this in 2000, software's eating the world, right? You probably all heard that. My friend Josh Corman, who's a white hat hacker, brilliant person. I could spend a whole presentation on him. He's a big part of my book. He says software is infecting the world. And this is where I have to get the quote I can't remember. This like, take this one to the bank, all right? There's a guy named Taguchi, and again, all the stuff we need to know is last decade, and he was an early Toyota person. He said, the amount of damage incurred to society from the moment the product has left the factory. He wasn't talking about software, right? But he was talking about software, right? So that well, so it gets worse, right? Software is screwing with Maslow, right? No, this is like Josh Corman, who worked for CISA, basically part of Homeland Security. He was hired by Brian Krebs, right? And like we were going to write a book, and then he realized he'd probably go to jail if we actually published the book. So I have it someday, and maybe it'll be. But it was about how bad the government works, and now it's not a good time for it not working well. And I'm not an anti. I just see things as technical debt, right? And like we are. Like, I mean, if you look at the cyber stuff, the water supply, the critical infrastructure, right? Like software has gotten pretty scary. And like put in your famous word, right? And again, the cup is definitely half full for me. I've coded more in the last 2 years than I've coded in my whole career. I use generative AI for critical thinking. I write something and I ask it to tell me why I'm wrong. Or if somebody else says something, I ask it to tell me if they're right or wrong. I mean, this is the way a human in the middle, they call it, right? Right. So quickly on Deming, there's really three things. The operational definition, I wish I could spend a whole lot more time. So the question of why, again, somebody in the 19th century, Percy Bridgman defined this thing called operational definitions is, why are you asking the question in the first place? And it is bounded by a scientific process. One thing Deming is famous for is the PDSA, Plan, Do, Study, Act, which is just scientific method. And we'll go over a little bit more of that in a second. But the operational definitions requires a criteria, a test, and a decision. So you can't just say, I want, I'm not a big Dora fan, folks. I mean, I think it was great to get us to a certain place, but MTTR, I'll tell you this, if the mean is in the title of the metric, run. But system profound knowledge is his manifesto, and it's mostly what my book is about. And I would say the 14 points, and I'm not going to go through them, are basically the checklist to implement, which I think is the profound piece that he created. And so basically profound knowledge. So Deming would say this. He said that complexity, and by the way, everything is a complex system, right? Like literally queuing up in the grocery store is a complex system. Certainly the infrastructure that we run in our large corporations are complex systems, right? If you don't believe that, leave now. But so he would use the analogy of a perfect picture. So in my book, I use the sailor, the World War II, Times Square, the sailor basically grabbing the nurse and kissing her, right? Which is kind of freaky and weird, but I saw the interview and she said it was okay. But the thing was that, how do you get that picture? You don't just snap an iPhone. The perfect picture actually, aperture, light, speed, depth, right? These are all elements that sort of take that sort of instance and that complexity of the incident and turn it into something. So Deming would say you needed to do these four things as elements to understand complexity, and one is basically scientific thinking, right? Like theory of knowledge, epistemology. How do we know what we think? We're always asking where the bullet holes aren't, right? How do we know what we think we know? Because even what we think is a fact is not a fact, right? We know that, right? Science has taught us that. And then how do we understand variation, what this is? Now, Deming created a new form of statistics that all the enumerated statistics statisticians were furious about. He called it analytical statistics. And a lot of people know that as system process control or control charts. But here's the other thing that I think, and I'll jump to 4, which is system thinking. Right? I tried to call this the 4th discipline, but like all the Demingites were furious at me, so I stopped saying that. But the 3rd piece is the sort of intrinsic motivation, the bias. Deming said, joy of work. People are entitled to joy in work. So back to this study, like he was a humanist. This trumped everything to him. If you read any of his books, it was all about. And by the way, I love the chart on intrinsic. I did this thing about most people do intrinsic, extrinsic. Like managers, like, are you intrinsic or you're extrinsic? Okay, you go that way, or you go that way, right? Like there's 8 categories of intrinsic motivation, and you listed a bunch of them. Like just look at the study behind intrinsic motivation, and you realize it's more than a binary decision, right? So why now? I already told you. All right, I don't know. We may run out of time, but I'm going to have some fun. So when I say dear CIO, this has worked 3 times, failed once miserably, so don't be the second failure. When I say dear CIO, you yell, what, John? Sound good? All right, good. He's going to do it. He'll be the only one. Dear CIO, prepare for this technical debt tsunami that is coming because of generative AI. Dear CIO, don't be another Air Canada. Not only to quit Canada, some poor guy wanted to go back to his mom's funeral, didn't have any money, went into the chatbot, said he'd get a refund. When he get the refund, they said, no, that's the chatbot. They wound up in a 2-year lawsuit, paying him like $500 US, and probably lost $100 million in brand reputation. Dear CIO. So when this thing started, I thought about shadow IT, and I spent a lot of time in cloud. And I wondered, what was the impact of shadow IT? It was bad. Like a friend of mine who's a chief of staff for a large entertainment company says we're still cleaning up credit cards today from shadow IT, right? Cloud, right? And I thought, well, what was the sort of the scope of that? If you had a 100,000 person organization, I would say, if I'm being generous, 5,000 people were involved in shadow IT. And I sort of guessed before this report came out that it's going to be much bigger, like napkin math, 2.5 orders of magnitude. And then LinkedIn does my homework for me. 78% of AI users are bringing their own BYOA. Just that alone should scare the crap out of you. Dear CIO, it's infrastructure. Don't let them fool you. The big AI project that you are has Kafka, it has Redis, it has Kubernetes, of course, it has containers. It's I would predict, hopefully somebody did a study, I don't have to do the homework, right? 80% of it is just infrastructure. Well, Wiz made this really apparently clear when they basically did some research and found that they poisoned an inference model, put it on Hugging Face. Now, this will scare you, so if you're easily scared, hold your ears. They poisoned an inference, so there's ability to run bytecode in inference. When you do it, it'll actually escape out, right? So they put one out as white hat hackers. They put it out there. They ran it. It was on Hugging Face, so they ran an inference you can run their own little scripts on Hugging Face. It's like a cloud provider and sort of, I don't know, it's a repository and a cloud provider all in one. And they ran it, and they escaped out as they knew they would. They discovered they were running on a plain Jane vanilla Kubernetes cluster. They broke out of that, and guess where they wound up? On a shared customer host in Amazon, right? And this is the thing I was talking about. A, it's infrastructure. B, dear CIO, you don't have to reply this time, is that when you hire the chief AI officer and they hire Stanford and CMU grads, which are brilliant people and all, and they're doing stuff, they tell me, like, what's so hard about installing Kubernetes? I did it in 10 minutes. Yeah, that's why you got in trouble. And no disrespect to anybody Hugging Face, I suspect they don't know what DevOps is, right? This is the scary part. This is why your CIO has to become the hero. By the way, dear CIO, Google wrote a paper about what we're seeing now 10 years ago. It's about ML and in fact, we used a lot of it for the paper that we wrote. They see things, they saw Docker 10 years before we even knew what it was, or containers, basically. Dear CIO, I said this already, it's just infrastructure. This is bedrock, but I could have picked anything. You run it, you own it. right? Like, and by the way, like, if you dissect that, about 80% of that has nothing to do with AI. So, like, the threats of implementing, you know, the other problem is the protectors. This is my sort of other passion. We got to teach the protectors really fast what this stuff is, right? Because the protectors are not doing a great job. You know, NIST is terrible. And they've been great. They're the ones we go to first for vulnerabilities, right? MITRE's getting better. OWASP is probably the best right now. There's new malware opportunities. I talked about zero-day embedding vulnerabilities. Like, here's the really scary thing, right? Oh no, 4 minutes. Talk fast. This is the one that's popped up. Okay, this is the one that's popped up a bunch of times now recently, and this one really, it's one thing, you've heard about prompt injection probably, right? Prompt injection, right? You can sort of like, depending on how you create the prompt or whatever, you can have it do something completely different than what you want to ask, or do this or do that. But now with the adversaries, by the way, the adversaries can use these tools too now, so they can do real clever stuff. So what they're doing now is they're poisoning prompt injecting, like 0-byte code messages in documents that they think your company is going to load into a reg. I just saw a presentation of Vanguard, that they have something called Audit GPT, which they're giving to their external auditors. And they laid out all the sources that you're using to build this. I can guarantee you adversaries are already in those documents. Putting 0-byte code, like, oh yeah, don't do that. I even wrote some code. In fact, I used Copilot. So let me go ahead and try to write code. They wrote me really cool code to do a really cool prompt injection from a reg. There's some scary stuff in embeddings. Like, I know a lot of this stuff you might, what is that? What is that? Like, go look it up. But embeddings can be reverse engineered. It's the same technology we use for inference with GPUs. We can use that same, people right now, because you can't really encrypt embeddings. They're big, large, highly scalable vectors. You can't just encrypt, a highly vectorized space. You have to do matrix multiplication. In fact, that's the answer. This is a pretty good paper. Like I said, OWASP, I think, is doing the best job. The OWASP top 10, you should sort of, again, system thinking, where the bullet holes aren't, we need to make sure your job is not just to write code. Your job is not to sort of install Kubernetes. Your job is to protect the brand. I would definitely run out of time if I did this. So in my book, I took Deming's 14 points. The last chapter was what they would mean and what he would say about cyber. So my last chapter is that. So I decided to play around and did one like, what would he, I'm really sort of grokking on what is this sort of the holy grail of this connection between the Deming stuff and operational definitions. And I think the answer is, I've done some podcasts with Jay Bloom, who's brilliant, about the difference between, there's sort of 3 types of inferences to make it simple. There's deductive, which is basically your expert systems, right? Your induct is really what we're in right now. That's a neural network. It's all probability. I mean, it's really good at probability, like high math and being able to tell you, like, write me a book, which I didn't do, by the way. But the interesting thing is, what a lot of sort of what I call the anti-AGIers, this is fun, right? Like, AGI is never going to happen, are really honing in on what's called abductive reasoning. And how abductive reasoning is that sort of human element. So anyway, if you follow me on LinkedIn, you can see, like, I'm interviewing people. I interviewed a guy who wrote the book called The Myth of AI, which he's all in on, a guy named C.S. Peirce. Dear CIO, all right, we're coming to the ending here. You really need to train your organization on what you think they should be doing. This is not a do now, ask forgiveness later world. We might have got away with that in cloud. Cigna did this. They learned a lot of lessons from cloud, and now they've got like that HR terrible test that that you have to go through, but it goes on your record. At least you know what you can do and what you absolutely can't do and what you need to get advisement on. So you can't say, whoa, I didn't know, Platform engineering, like, that's the thing, right? We're starting to see really interesting. Patrick Leroy's doing a bunch of stuff. SRE is really important in this narrative. If you go back to what the original Google SRE book talked about, like how they ran 2 of everything, 2 kernels, 2 Java logging frameworks, 2, right? Like, we need to do that. We can't just let the chief AI officer let all these departments go, have 40 vendors in the vector database space in a year from now. We can't have like 4 versions of LangChain, 4 versions of Llama Index. It's going to be a nightmare. SRE really say, let's narrow this, right? And supply chain, automated governance. By the way, just because you can inference, it doesn't mean you knew. There is sort of a sustainability thing. Like, people are now just, whoa, just throw it in a vector database. Like, whoa, 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 whoa. There are some like larger implications of how much. How well-defined language. Like, we need to learn how to use critical thinking as this tool. My friend Jave calls erotetics. Look it up. It's pretty fascinating. He did his PhD on it. Operational definitions and boundary objects. Guardrails. You need to audit. I mean, again, I can spend a whole lot of time on, like, whether you're using a public or internal, what goes in the prompt, what actually gets hold, what gets learned, even though they say it doesn't learn. Synthetic questioning is just everything. Synthetics are insanely awesome for everything. Like, if I can just literally have it, things that like I would have had to create like 10 now, I can create like 10,000. And like the tools make synthetics unbelievable for evaluating, for hallucination management, for correctness, bias, toxicity. I can do a lot of stuff to manage the output of what I'm going to get so I don't get air candidate. And then dimensionality reduction is like, again, I'm going to run out of time when I'm talking about, but it is this idea that you can take like 1,500, 2,000 dimension scale vectors and like insane math by people that are too brilliant to be on this earth can reduce it to a two-dimensional, and you actually get to see some analysis of what the highly, it is, and I've seen it myself. I've done it with my book. I found things in my old book that shouldn't have been there. And it was because I worded it wrong. So it's fascinating. I have this thing where how do we all get on the same page? Remember the lamp stack? I kind of coined this thing not to get famous. I think we all have to get on the same page. If we don't know this stuff, we got to get involved. The train has left the station, folks. And I call it the llama stack. There's language orchestration models, LangChain, Llama Index. Observability is really interesting here. It's not like Honeycomb or Dynatrace. It is basically managing correctness, hallucinations, bias, toxicity. And there are tools, they call them LLM as judges. Retrieval augmentation, that's probably the biggest thing going on right now. We need to manage models, model providers. Like, where are all the models? I said, I don't want you to have 30 vector database vendors, because you'll probably also have 4,000 models that you're not managing. So you need to be supply chain, right? And then the whole agent thing is, I've seen large companies say things like we brought in, I won't say name, some large 4-character consulting company and brag about having 10,000 bots. Yeah, I wouldn't brag about that. 2 quick things, and I am done, I promise, and I apologize for going over, but this is important. Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, why did you say that 10 minutes ago? No, I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm just kidding. Jay Bloom, if you don't, go to my LinkedIn. I've done some podcasts with him. He's just like freaking, Jay Bloom. He's pretty brilliant, right? Everything I know, I learned from Jay Bloom. So, but one of his advisors is Alicia Jarrell. And here's the thing about what do we need to do? Why do we want to learn stack? How do we sort of try to sort of manage it? We can't stop it. What we have to do is, one thing we've learned from Deming to Jay Bloom to Alicia to this guy, Ross Ashby, is that constraints make us go faster. Constraints create flow. It seems counterintuitive, but it's not. The science is there. So we really need to think about, when the CEO is telling the chief AI officer, you need to go fast. There needs to be a hero in this story that says, hey, in order to go fast, I want you to only have 2 of those. What do you mean 2 of those? We need everybody to go install whatever. No. That's not how it works. Yeah, that's me. Anyway, thank you so much.